Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the answer to a question that one of you has proposed and which I am delighted to talk about. The question was, a lot of you people, that's us, critics and others, talk about Donald Francis Tovey. We cite his opinions and quote him regularly. And who is he? That was the question. Who the hell was Donald Francis Tovey that we should all be quoting him? It's actually a very good question because you see his name popping up all over the place. And so here is the answer. Tovey was a British musicologist, conductor, composer, and essayist. He lived from 1875 to 1940. He's best known for a series of books called Essays in Musical Analysis. He was a professor of music at the University of Edinburgh. He was the Reed Professor of Music, and he conducted the orchestra there. And for those orchestral concerts, he wrote a series of program notes, which later became the Essays in Musical Analysis, which were published in the late 1930s. They are some of the most brilliant essays ever to be written on musical subjects, and they cover most of the basic repertoire, and that's what makes them so valuable. I mean, the entire orchestral repertoire that he had access to, that is, that he was able to perform for his audiences, plus a few other essays that he wrote elsewhere, and there was a volume on chamber music as well. Now, Tovey's essays are an amazing resource for people who are getting to know classical music, and I recommend them unreservedly. They are a little bit above the basic beginner level in a couple of respects. First of all, in the style of writing, which, given someone who was born in 1875, is kind of 1875-ish, although they're very approachable. I mean, he's not writing down to anybody, and he's not writing Shakespearean English, so you don't have to worry about that. But he is assuming that somebody who can read these things can read music. When I first started reading his essays, I was in high school, and I had no idea who he was, and I just was starting to read them, and I went, oh, someone finally talks about music. I didn't understand all the musical examples. So you can get a lot out of him in terms of what he basically has to say without having to be able to follow actual musical examples like in your head. But remember, he came from a period when most people, in order to hear music, made music at home. And so there was somebody who had at least a passing acquaintance with the piano. And so his essays they're written in piano-y type score, condensed versions. And he's sort of assuming that you'll be able to figure them out. But if you know the music, you can figure out what he's talking about and follow along. So that's not a problem. In addition to the essays in musical analysis, he did essays on Beethoven's piano sonatas, on musicological subjects. He published editions of Bach and Beethoven, some of which are still in use. As a composer, he was fairly unsuccessful. He wrote a symphony, a piano concerto, an excruciatingly dull cello concerto that lasts forever for Pablo Casals, who was a friend of his. He was knighted. He was a sir, supposedly on Elgar's recommendation. They were friendly. He was in the thick of English musical life of the period. And I have his stuff here. Let me just show you what it is. Wait a minute. Here are the original essays in musical analysis. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 volumes. And they were republished fairly recently, actually, by Oxford University Press, not in these lovely little red volumes, but collected by genre, all the symphonies and all the concertos and all the other things, and in a couple of 2 or 3 fatter volumes, but they're not complete as they were republished. And this is the juicy complete series. And I'm going to tell you what's in them, just so you know. Because it really is worth looking up, this stuff. The guy was brilliant. And I'm going to try and explain a little bit how in the basics. But what made Tovey so wonderful as a commentator on music, I'm putting these in order, here we go, was that he really was a terrific listener. He was basically a conservative. His teacher was Hubert Parry. And, his life story, it reads like, every one of those life stories from that period. I'm a frail child. He was educated by private tutors at home in a loveless household. That sort of thing. But that's sort of what it was. His dad was a teacher. His mother was who knows. And he had a tutor. And, they taught tutorial things. But he was musically quite gifted. And so, let's see. Essays in Musical Analysis. Volume 1 is Symphonies. Now, the Symphonies, Volume 1, basically concern the basic ones. Beethoven, Brahms, Haydn, Mozart, and Schubert, and then Mendelssohn's Italian Symphony. And that's it. And there are not many of them. I mean, he does all the Beethoven symphonies, of course. And then he does the 4 Brahms symphonies and the serenades. Haydn is fascinating. He was unique in his time in vehemently recommending Haydn and playing lots of Haydn. But there wasn't much Haydn published. He was impatiently awaiting, a critical edition of Haydn's symphonies so he could see how Haydn developed as a symphonist. He didn't know and could only speculate. And so some of these symphonies are published under strange numbers, and they're very, very funny. Let me see what he starts with a wonderful essay called Haydn the Inaccessible, about how we just don't know what Haydn wrote. And then the Haydn Symphony number 104, the London Symphony, which in those days was known as number 2, which is just demented. I think he says something about that here. Let me take a quick little peek, because it's just in almost any edition of Haydn's works, you may safely assume that the work called number 1 or number 2 is really the last. And he's right. He's absolutely right. Modern research has sifted out 104 works as genuine symphonies from the innumerable crowd of symphonies, divertimenti, operatic overtures, and suppositions works that have passed as Haydn's. And this symphony in D, arguably the greatest of Haydn's instrumental works, with the Quartet in F, Opus 77, number 2, as its compeer, is, of course, number 104 in the chronological list, now in the course of publication in the long overdue edition of Haydn's complete works. Well, that long overdue edition still has not been finished. That one ended, the one he talked about, grossly incomplete, and they're still working on it. So there you go. Anyway, so that's volume 1. Let's see what I can do here with volume 2. In volume 2, we get like everyone else's symphonies in the Romantic period. You get Schumann symphonies, 3 of them, not all 4. The César-Franck Symphony, 2 Bruckner symphonies, Tchaikovsky's Pathétique, Dvorak's symphonies, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, and 3. You get numbers 6, 7, 5, and 9. Those were known as 1, 2, 3, and 5 back in the day. Number 4 was the 8th, which Tovey did not like. And the reason Tovey didn't like it is because it was not written in classical forms. And anything not written in classical forms, in Tovey's point of view, was slumming. This was his weakness, by the way. He had excessive reverence for the classics, and he was very quick to judge things that did not take on what he regarded as the imperishable and immortal forms of the great masters. And he really felt that way about them. There is no greater guide to music within those forms than Tovey. But he's not really very good talking about more contemporary pieces. He was something of a fan of Hindemith, and he was very kind, as you might have expected, to his contemporary English composers, to Elgar and Vaughan Williams and that crowd. Julius Röntgen was a friend of his up in Edinburgh. They knew each other. And so, here it is, Julius Röntgen, Symphony in F minor. See, he included that one. They were his friends. So he would be nice to them. He also said that the job of the writer of program notes is that of counsel for the defense. So in other words, if he was playing something, whether he liked it or not was irrelevant. He was supposed to make the best case for it, which I think was a very fair point of view to take. Then we've got Tchaikovsky's Pathétique Symphony. Did I mention that? I don't know. And Sibelius's Symphonies 3 and 5, and Vaughan Williams' Pastoral Symphony. And then we've got, I said he's got Elgar in here too, the second, and orchestral variations, series of variations, and Bach's orchestral music, the Brandenburgs and the orchestral suites, a little bit of Handel, and a little bit of Holst, and a few other people like that. So that's volume 2. And again, it's about what you'd expect in terms of repertoire from somebody of that period. His own music, as I pointed out, was very conservative and really not all that interesting, although the piano concerto is a good work. It's been recorded by Hyperion in its Romantic Piano Concerto series, coupled with a piano concerto by Mackenzie, another one of his Scottish buddies, and that's worth hearing. It's interesting. But let's see, Volume 3 is concertos, and it's devoted mostly to Mozart and Beethoven. And then you've got Chopin, Joachim's Hungarian Concerto. He was a friend of Joachim. They knew each other. They played together. Brahms, Dvorak's Cello Concerto, Elgar's Violin Concerto. And then we get some interesting things. Arthur Somerville. Not a lot of people play Somerville. The Franck Symphonic Variations. Dochnani's Nursery Variations. Spohr, his 8th Violin Concerto. Some Schumann, some Saint-Saëns. He describes Saint-Saëns as the greatest composer who wasn't a genius, which is that a wonderfully shady comment, isn't it? Oh, God. But he had the same attitude towards French music that most British people did. It was suspicious because it was sexy. And that was always something that was suspect. And then you've got the Bruch Violin Concerto, Stanford's Clarinet Concerto, the Elgar Violin Concerto, the Delius Violin Concerto, the Strauss Paragon to the Symphonia Domestica. Well, there's a little novel thingy. A Glazunov Concerto, which is nifty. The Sibelius Violin Concerto. Franz Schmidt, Variations on a Theme of Beethoven. Respighi's Concerto Gregoriano. And the Walton Viola Concerto, which he regarded as a major, major masterpiece. So that is a very, very interesting collection of concertos, and it reflects a wider range than the normal stuff because, he had to go with what his soloists were playing and some of the things that he thought that they ought to do or ought not to do. And then we've got illustrative music. This is program music. I'm not going to go through the contents. It's symphonic poems and Wagner bits and Berlioz thingies and a lot of music that you wouldn't usually include, a lot of overtures by Weber and Schubert and Mendelssohn, and then you've got his beloved master Parry, the overture to an unwritten tragedy, and Julius Röntgen pops up again, Smetana, Dvorak, a couple of Slavonic rhapsodies, and we've got Bantock and McEwen and Walker and Vaughan Williams' The Wasps and Rager's Berkland tone poems, Holst, Vermeulen, and Hindemith's Kammermusik. So that's quite interesting. Again, he's nicer about chamber music than he would be about symphonies and other pieces because they're not working in classical forms. And then we've got vocal music, which is Bach and Handel and, the usual. You've got Messiah and some madrigals and some Bach cantatas and Haydn's oratorios and the Missa Solemnis and a bit of Fidelio and the Verdi Requiem and the Brahms German Requiem and that kind of stuff. The normal choral things. And this wonderful, wonderful supplementary essays, glossary, and index. Now, under this dry title, there is some wonderful, wonderful writing. Most importantly was Tovey's attitude towards Mahler, because you would think Mahler would be a composer that Tovey hated. But Tovey was open-minded enough to understand that any composer who was able to exploit classical forms the way Mahler was able to exploit classical forms was someone worth listening to. And he wrote a very passionate, extended, and wonderful essay on Mahler's Fourth Symphony, which is in here, along with a lot of other nifty stuff. I mean, there's Gluck and C.P.E. Bach and Joseph Méhul, and some more Schumann and Berlioz and the Tchaikovsky Fifth Symphony and Rager and some Havergal Bryan, his fantastic variations on an old rhyme, and Adolf Busch and Eugene Zador, his rondo, and some more Wagner, an essay on playing Wagner in bleeding chunks. But the Mahler essay has a wonderful, wonderful line here. Let me get it out for you. Here we go. Okay. Yes. One of the things that he writes is this. The infuriating quality of Mahler's music is particularly antiseptic against snobs. There is no class of composer, diabolist or purist, for whom a first impression of Mahler will not cause pangs of jealousy. Mahler is no Shakespeare, and few, if any of us, are Coleridges, but we would all write like that if we had the mind. He has no inhibitions. My own belief is that a vogue for Mahler has already been of great benefit to musical culture all over the world and will continue to be useful for a longer time than I can estimate. I think that's absolutely great. It's just fabulous. What we composers find so disconcerting about Mahler, he writes, is that every aspect of his work shows all the advantages of an unchecked facility and none of the disadvantages. Anyway, he keeps going on like that, and it's really marvelous. He was an interesting guy for that reason. Let me just put it to you that way. And his openness to that kind of music, at least, Berlioz, Mahler, some of the other classics, he saw what they could do, and he was willing to admit them to the pantheon. And he didn't admit many. He really did. He had very, very high standards. The last volume of the Essays in Musical Analysis is Chamber Music. It's a supplementary volume. And, there are some things he says in this and other volumes that were so resonated with me when I was first, starting to understand music and listen to music, because he talks about music as music. That is, he doesn't have political aims. He talks about music in musical terms. For example, I'll give you an example. When he talks about Debussy's Nocturnes, which he never had a chance to play, and also some other works that use a wordless chorus, he said, it's a very interesting question in musical aesthetics. What happens when you use wordless voices with an orchestra? And the reason he said is this. He said, because the minute you hear a human voice, you expect words. And so your hearing immediately pushes all the instruments into the background, and you focus on the sound of the human voice, expecting to hear words. Now, he says, what happens when you don't hear words is something I haven't had a chance to experience yet. But I'm very interested to know what it is. But you see, that is one of those essential observations about the nature of music and the relationship between music and voices that it's obvious once you think about it, but someone has to say it so that you understand what you're listening to. And it's the same with his volume of chamber music. He spends a great deal of time in the introductory essay talking about the difference between music for small forces, a small number of people, and music for a limited number of parts. In other words, in Baroque chamber music, trio sonatas and whatnot, you have a specific number of voices, of voice parts. But it doesn't matter how many people play them. That is, the continuo part can have 2, can have 3, can have 4 people. You can double, you can replace things. It doesn't matter. As long as the polyphony, as long as the lines, the parts are clear. So if it's a 3-part or 3-voice piece, it's in 3 parts, and who plays it doesn't matter. But in classical chamber music, it's written for a specific number of people, for a specific forces. A string quartet is written for 4 players, never more than 4 players, never less, and every part has to be necessary to contribute to the whole. This, for me, was a revolutionary observation, because it really explained what the difference was between the Baroque and classical periods in terms of their handling of instrumental music. The idea of parts being necessary and all the parts cooperating to support and interact with each other, and a style in which there was a bass line, a bottom with a harpsichord or a keyboard or something, and all the harmony stuck there in the bottom with the melody parts on top. Very, very simple observation again. But Tovey was somebody who could really just get to the heart of the matter. And that's why his writing is so valuable and I think so incredibly interesting. There's also another book here that came out fairly recently of other writings that I would not recommend. It's fairly technical. This is talks, essays, other writings, uncollected papers, stuff from his desk. It's called The Classics of Music. And it's just a bunch of, so there are some more sort of unedited and cleaned up program notes that could have gone into essays and musical analysis. Some of them are really quite poor. he needed an editor like everybody else. It's very interesting to learn. But that is who Donald Tovey was. He's extremely quotable. One of the best lines he ever had, which I have cited many, many times in these talks, is what he had to say about period instruments. He wasn't saying it about period instruments particularly, because that the movement didn't exist when he was writing, but it's applicable to that. What he said is, scholarship itself is not obliged to insist on the restoration of conditions that ought never to have existed in the first place. I think that is such a powerful observation. When you hear some loony telling you, well, in 1702 there was a performance of this by 3 people in the bathroom of a carriage stop on the post on the way to Leipzig, and he's like, okay, yeah, so, yeah, and instruments were horribly constructed and people played like pigs and the circumstances were all contrary to what the composer wanted. And so we have no business playing music that way. We should be playing music in the best way we can play music. That was Tovey's position, and I support it wholeheartedly. So that, my friends, explains who Donald Francis Tovey was. I hope this was helpful to you, especially to those who are asking. And if you hear people quoting him, that's why. And what they're largely quoting, what they're citing, is this batch of stuff here, these volumes, the essays in musical analysis, which are still available in one form or another. And I do recommend that you read them if you're curious, if you want to get into music with a little bit more depth and with a really, really smart perspective, with the one grain of salt, like I said, that Tovey's feeling that classical forms were handed down by God eternally and for all time is a little bit outmoded. But it served him very well for what he had to do, and that's the point. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.